Dawn. January 6, 1971. The air is sterile and cold. It carries not the scent of earth or pine, but the faint metallic tang of filtered circulation and ozone. This is not a place meant for life. We are in the Launch Control Center of Oscar Zero, a Minuteman II missile complex buried 60 feet beneath the Great Plains of North Dakota. The room is a capsule of subdued light. The soft green glow of radar scopes, the amber pulse of status indicators, the crisp white of alphanumeric printouts slowly scrolling from a teletype machine. Two officers in flight suits, a commander and a deputy, sit facing a vast console, its panels a constellation of switches and warning lights. Their eyes are not on each other, but on the unchanging data streams. The only sounds are the hum of redundant power systems and the low whir of reel-to-reel tapes recording nothing but routine. On a large wall map of the United States, a grid of numbered points stretches from the Rockies to the Dakotas. One of these points, linked by a thin wire to this center, represents Launch Facility November 33. Inside its 90-ton blast door, a 60-foot-tall, 70,000-pound cylinder of cold steel, solid fuel, and tritium sits in absolute darkness. It is fueled, targeted, and awake. It has been on continuous alert for 1,920 days. It requires no orders, no external signal to maintain its readiness. It is a machine built for a single purpose, sleeping with one eye open. In a silo just like it, and in 999 others scattered across the continent's lonely expanses, an entire arsenal waits in perfect, silent stasis. The two men in the capsule are its custodians. They monitor its health. They authenticate the codes that would, if ever transmitted, command it to unleash its 1.2 megaton soul. But for now, they simply watch. Half a world away in a dramatically different command bunker outside Moscow, another set of officers watches too. But they are not watching the health of a machine. They are watching the ghost of it. On their situation maps, those 1,000 points in America's heartland are not just coordinates. They are a permanent, inescapable question mark etched into their strategic reality. A mathematical equation of existential dread that has already begun to reshape the destiny of nations, leading them inexorably toward the dusty passes of a remote, mountainous land. To understand the terror that the Minuteman missile inspired in the Soviet High Command, we must first travel to the moment that trauma was born. Not to the plains of America, but to the tropical waters of the Caribbean. October 28, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis reaches its climax. Soviet freighters, shadowed by U.S. warships, approach the quarantine line. In the skies over Cuba, American U-2 reconnaissance planes are scanned by Soviet-made radars. Nuclear-armed bombers are on standby, and ballistic missile submarines stalk the depths. The world holds its breath, balanced on the edge of thermonuclear war. For 13 days, the confrontation had laid bare a brutal truth. In the calculus of nuclear brinkmanship, the Soviet Union was operating from a position of profound and publicly exposed inferiority. The United States possessed over 3,500 strategic nuclear warheads that could reach Soviet soil. The USSR had perhaps 300, mostly vulnerable, slow-to-fuel liquid propellant bombers and early-generation intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. The crisis was resolved through secret diplomacy and public compromise. But in Moscow, the lesson was seared into the psyche of the political and military leadership. Nikita Khrushchev had been forced to back down, to publicly withdraw his missiles from Cuba. The humiliation was not just political, it was existential. The USSR had been held at gunpoint and found its own gun was neither loaded nor reliable. The American strategic advantage in 1962 was overwhelming, but it had a critical weakness. It was primarily a first strike force. It consisted of bombers that required hours to get airborne and early-model Atlas and Titan I missiles that were stored in massive soft-skin silos and required lengthy fueling with volatile liquid oxygen before launch, a process taking close to an hour. They were potent weapons of aggression, but poor weapons of retaliation. If the Soviets could land a surprise blow, they might cripple this force on the ground. The US response to this vulnerability was not to scale back, but to engineer it away. The answer emerged from the drawing boards of solid-fuel rocket pioneers and the cold logic of think tanks like the Rand Corporation. The goal was a new kind of weapon system, one that was not just powerful, but survivable, instantaneous, and enduring. It needed to be so secure in its second strike capability that no rational adversary would ever consider launching a first strike. This doctrine became known as mutual assured destruction, and its physical embodiment was the LGM-30 Minuteman, named for the citizen soldiers of the American Revolution who could be ready to fight at a minute's notice. The Minuteman missile was a revolution in strategic design. Its core innovation was its solid propellant rocket motors. Unlike liquid-fueled rockets that required complex, time-consuming fueling before launch, the Minuteman's fuel was cast into a solid, stable grain inside its motor casing. It was essentially ready to fly, always. This allowed for a fundamental shift in deployment. The missile could be sealed inside a hardened, reinforced concrete launch silo, connected to an underground launch control center by miles of hardened cable. It could sit for years, maintained in a state of constant readiness. From the moment a valid launch order was authenticated, the missile could be ignited and climbing out of its silo in less than 60 seconds. The first Minuteman I missiles went on alert in 1962 as the Cuban crisis unfolded. But it was the subsequent models that created the architecture of dread. The Minuteman I was followed by the more powerful Minuteman II in 1965 with greater range, a more accurate guidance system, and a hardened re-entry vehicle to punch through atmospheric interference. Then came the Apex, the Minuteman III, deployed starting in 1970. This was the system that would haunt Soviet nightmares. It carried not one, but three independently targetable re-entry vehicles, MARVs. A single missile, from one silo, could deliver three separate 170-kiloton nuclear warheads to three different targets hundreds of miles apart. Each warhead was capable of obliterating a hardened command bunker or a strategic missile silo. By the early 1970s, the United States had completed the deployment of 1,000 of these missiles. 550 Minuteman IIIs, each with three warheads, and 550 Minuteman IIs, each with a single, more powerful warhead. They were scattered across the desolate expanses of Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Missouri, in fields known to the military as the 41st, 9041st, 321st, 44th, and 351st Strategic Missile Wings. This was not a fleet that needed to be assembled. It was not a force that gave warning as it prepared. It was a condition, a perpetual state of threatened retaliation, embedded in the very geology of the American continent. For the Soviet General Staff, watching through the hazy lens of satellite imagery and signals intelligence, it presented an insoluble problem. They could not be disarmed by a surprise attack. The 1,000 Minutemen were a sleeping army that could awaken, entirely, in the space of a single terrible minute. This technological and strategic reality created a seated anxiety, a claustrophobia of encirclement. And as the 1970s progressed, that anxiety would begin to seek outlets, to distort Soviet perceptions of threats far from the missile fields, in the unstable politics of the Third World. The stage was being set for a confrontation no Minuteman crew could have envisioned, in a country whose name would become synonymous with the unraveling of a superpower. The Minuteman force did not exist in a vacuum. It was the central pillar of a new, terrifyingly precise American strategic doctrine that evolved through 1970s. Counterforce. Mutual assured destruction, in its purest form, was a city-targeting, counter-value strategy. The threat was the wholesale destruction of population and industrial centers. It was horrific, but to some strategists, it lacked credibility. Would a president really unleash Armageddon on American cities in response to a Soviet attack on a purely military target? To bolster the credibility of the nuclear deterrent, the U.S. began to develop options for limited nuclear war. The key to this was the Minuteman III's accuracy. Its NS-20 inertial guidance system, constantly updated by a flight computer, gave it a circular error probable, the radius within which half the warheads would land of less than 200 meters. This was not city-killer accuracy. This was silo-killer accuracy. Counterforce doctrine shifted the targeting priority from Soviet society to Soviet military power itself. Its ICBM silos, its bomber bases, its submarine pens, its command and control bunkers. The goal was not mutual suicide, but the disarming first strike, or more chillingly, the preemptive decapitation of the enemy's ability to retaliate. With its MIRVs and pinpoint accuracy, a single Minuteman III could theoretically hold at risk 3 separate hardened Soviet missile silos. For the Soviet leadership, this was the ultimate nightmare scenario given form. Their own strategic missile force, the pride of the rocket forces, was fundamentally different in composition and character. It relied heavily on massive liquid-fueled behemoths like the SS-9 Scarp and the later SS-18 Satan. These missiles were more powerful, carrying warheads of 20 megatons or more. But they were cumbersome. They required lengthy fueling procedures before launch, making them vulnerable to a lightning-fast American strike. They were, in the grim terminology of the era, soft targets. The Soviet Union was racing to harden its silos and deploy its own solid fuel missiles like the SS-16 and SS-20, but they were perpetually behind. The American lead in microelectronics, solid fuel chemistry, and guidance technology was a gap they could not close. Every new U.S. advancement, the imminent deployment of the even more accurate Trident D5 submarine missile, the development of stealth technology, the persistent rumors of a practicable missile defense, was perceived in Moscow not as an incremental improvement, but as a move toward achieving a first strike capability. This perceived window of vulnerability bred a pathological obsession with strategic depth and peripheral security. The Soviet Empire was a vast, continental power with a long, historically insecure border. The Minuteman threat came from over the North Pole. But Soviet strategic thinking, steeped in the lessons of the Great Patriotic War, saw threats as multidirectional and total. If the United States could not be matched warhead for warhead in a central nuclear exchange, then every other frontier became critical. Any loss of influence on the periphery was not merely a geopolitical setback. It was interpreted as the thinning of a defensive buffer, a potential new front from which the West could apply pressure, deploy shorter-range nuclear systems, or gather intelligence. This mindset, the flank obsession, fused nuclear terror with conventional paranoia. It was codified in the Brezhnev Doctrine, declared after the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. Once a country was within the socialist camp, its departure was impermissible, as it would weaken the entire Soviet security system. This doctrine applied not just to Eastern Europe, but to any ally whose collapse could be exploited by the West. By the late 1970s, this state of high-alert paranoia was reaching a fever pitch. Detente, the period of eased tensions, was crumbling. The Soviet deployment of the SS-20 mobile missile aimed at Western Europe had triggered a furious NATO response. The two-track decision to deploy Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe. These systems, particularly the Pershing II with its blistering 10-minute flight time to Moscow, felt to the Soviet leadership like the tactical embodiment of the Minuteman's strategic threat, a decapitating first-strike weapon on their doorstep. And then, in 1979, the southern flank began to collapse. In February, the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah, a key U.S. ally. American listening posts aimed at Soviet missile tests vanished overnight. In November, militants seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca, unleashing shockwaves across the Muslim world. In Washington, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski spoke ominously of an arc of crisis stretching from the Horn of Africa to the Hindu Kush. For the aging men in the Kremlin, Peering at their maps through the lens of nuclear anxiety, the Minuteman fields to the north were a static, quantifiable threat. But the chaos to the south was dynamic, infectious, and terrifyingly proximate. The Minuteman had locked them into a strategic stalemate they could not win. Now, the crumbling state of Afghanistan, on their very border, presented a crisis they felt they could not afford to lose. The logic of the silo was about to be applied to the mountains. To step into the command bunkers of the Soviet High Command in the late 1970s is to enter a world of quantified paranoia. The men who made the decision to invade Afghanistan, the Politburo members like Brezhnev, Andropov, Ustinov, and Gromyko, advised by the senior brass of the General Staff, were not reckless adventurers. They were, by their own lights, cold rationalists acting under immense, mathematically expressed duress. Foremost among these military minds was Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, first Deputy Minister of Defense and Chief of the General Staff from 1977. Ogarkov was a technocrat, a believer in the revolution in military affairs, driven by microprocessors and precision guidance. He understood the American lead better than anyone. He peered across the Iron Curtain and saw not just weapons, but a system. The Minuteman's instant readiness, the B-52's airborne alert, the Ohio-class submarine stealth, all woven together by satellites and computers into a seamless, resilient killing machine. For Ogarkov and his colleagues, games and strategic estimates produced a constant, grim output. Studies like the famous Seven-Day War simulations showed that in a conventional European conflict, NATO's technological edge might force a rapid, losing Soviet retreat. The only recourse to prevent catastrophic defeat would be the early, desperate use of tactical nuclear weapons, a move they knew would trigger an all-out strategic exchange. And in that exchange, the numbers were clear. A single, deceptively simple metric governed their dread: the exchange ratio. To maintain credible deterrence, Soviet planners believed they needed the ability to survive an American first strike and retain enough warheads to destroy a given percentage of U.S. economic and military targets. The Minuteman Authority's MIRV capability was systematically degrading this ratio. One U.S. missile could kill 3 Soviet ones. The mathematics were shifting day by day in America's favor. This was not an abstract exercise. It translated into a specific haunting requirement: launch on warning. Because their liquid-fueled ICBMs were vulnerable to a decapitating strike, Soviet doctrine began to lean heavily toward retaliating upon receiving confirmation of incoming American missiles before the warheads actually impacted. This compressed decision-making from hours to minutes. It placed the entire fate of civilization on the reliability of radar feeds and satellite sensors, systems they knew were fallible. The 1979 false alarm incident, when a Soviet early warning satellite mistakenly interpreted sunlight glinting off clouds as missile launches, was a secret trauma that ran through the command structure. They were living on a hair trigger that the Americans, with their survivable Minutemen, did not have to rely upon. This state of perpetual high-alert vulnerability shaped their worldview into a defensive crouch. Every Western move was interpreted as part of a coordinated, long-term strategy to weaken and ultimately destroy the USSR. The deployment of Pershing IIs in Europe was not a political counter to the SS-20. It was the placement of a gun at their temple. The support for dissidents like Andrei Sakharov was not about human rights. It was ideological sabotage. And the political turbulence in Afghanistan was not a local tribal conflict. It was the leading edge of the arc of crisis, a deliberate Western ploy to poke a hole in their southern underbelly, potentially bringing American influence and maybe even missile bases to their very border. Their decision-making was a fortress mentality applied to geopolitics. The invasion of Afghanistan, debated in a series of closed Politburo sessions in December 1979, was framed not as an aggressive expansion, but as a preemptive stabilization. They were not invading a sovereign nation. They were securing a buffer, plugging a leak in the dike before the entire wall gave way. The The Minuteman had convinced them they could not win a direct confrontation, so they would fight an indirect one, on ground of their choosing, to prevent what they saw as a slow-motion strategic encirclement. It was a catastrophic error in judgment, but from within the paranoid logic of their bunkers, it was a logical, even necessary, act of national defense. Visually, the contrast between the American and Soviet ICBM fields tells the story of two different engineering philosophies born from two different strategic areas. A Minuteman launch facility is a study in minimalist, automated defense. It is not a fortress. It is a hole in the ground. The silo itself is a cylindrical concrete liner surrounded by a shock-absorbing cavity, capped by a 90-ton concrete and steel door that slides sideways. There are no visible defenses, no anti-aircraft guns, no guard towers. Its security lies in its secrecy, its hardness, and its dispersion across 100,000 square miles of remote territory. To destroy 1,000, an attacker would need to land 2,000 or more highly accurate warheads almost simultaneously across a continent-sized area, a practical impossibility. The missile inside is a masterpiece of solid steadiness. Its three-stage solid fuel motors are inert, stable, and ready. Its guidance system is a sealed, self-contained inertial platform that knows its position from the moment it is installed. Maintenance crews perform periodic tests, but they do not fuel the missile. They check its electronics. It is more like a satellite in a canister than a traditional rocket. The Launch Control Center, miles away, is its brain. Two officers must agree, turning their keys simultaneously to initiate a launch sequence that is entirely automated. The system is designed for one thing: to ensure that if the order comes, the missiles will fly, even if the surrounding countryside is already a radioactive wasteland. It is a system built for retaliation. A Soviet R-36 Smetan Satan silo, in contrast, is a monument to brute force and centralized control. It is a massive hardened complex, often with visible perimeter defenses. It is deeper, wider, and built to withstand a closer overpressure. But inside's a very different beast. The SA-18 is a liquid-fueled giant. Its propellants, hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, are highly toxic, corrosive, and volatile. They cannot be stored inside the missile for long periods. Therefore, the missile sits in its silo largely unfueled. The fuel is kept in separate, heavily shielded tanks within the complex. In a crisis, the launch sequence is a lengthy, delicate ballet of high-pressure plumbing. Pumps must transfer thousands of gallons of cryogenic and hazardous liquids into the missile's tanks, a process taking up to an hour. Technicians must then pressurize the systems and run checks. Only then can it be launched. This made the SS-18, for all its 20-megaton fury, a sitting duck in the face of a Minuteman strike. Its survival depended on getting the warning and beginning the fueling process before the American warheads arrived, a desperate race against time. This technological asymmetry was the core of Soviet vulnerability. The Minuteman was a sprinter, already in the blocks. The SS-18 was a weightlifter, needing time to strap on its belt and chalk its hands. American strategy aimed to shoot the weightlifter before he could even stand up. Soviet strategy was therefore consumed with finding a way to protect him or to divert the sprinter's attention entirely. This fundamental imbalance in the crown jewels of strategic power colored every other aspect of Soviet military and foreign policy, driving them to compensate in areas where they believed they still held an advantage, the vast conventional armies that would now be ordered across the Amu Darya River. The Minuteman-induced stalemate created a strategic paradox for the Soviet Union. Frozen in the central confrontation, they became hyper-vigilant along their periphery. Every tremor in the geopolitical landscape was interpreted through the lens of this primary, unmanageable threat. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. Because they could not defeat America's secure second strike capability, they had to prevent America from gaining any advantage, anywhere, that could be leveraged in the larger struggle. This is the genesis of the flank obsession. The Soviet Union's borders were not just lines on a map. They were the walls of a fortress under perpetual siege. The Eastern European satellite states were a buffer zone, an early warning system paid for in the blood of the Red Army in 1945. Any crack in that wall, like the Prague Spring, was met with brutal reinforcement. But by the late 1970s, the southern flank, the vast, porous border with the Muslim world from Turkey to China, was looking alarmingly fragile. Here, the threat was not battalions of NATO tanks, but the more insidious forces of political Islam, nationalism, and American covert action. The Soviet model of socialism was losing its appeal. The spark of anti-colonial, religiously tinged resistance was gaining potency. Afghanistan sat at the precarious hinge of this southern flank. For decades, it had been a carefully managed neutral buffer, receiving aid from both Moscow and Washington. But the Sour Revolution of April 1978, which brought the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, changed the calculus. Suddenly, Afghanistan was not a neutral neighbor but a socialist ally, and a profoundly unstable one. The PDPA regime, led Nur Mohammad Taraki and then Hafizullah Amin, embarked on a program of radical, violent reforms that alienated the deeply traditional, tribal populace. Rebellion spread from the countryside. By mid-1979, large swathes of the country were in open revolt. The Afghan army was melting away through desertion and mutiny. In Moscow, this disintegration was not seen as a local tragedy. It was viewed as a creeping disaster with direct implications for Soviet nuclear security. The KGB, under Yuri Andropov, fed the Politburo alarming reports. They painted Amin as unreliable, possibly even a CIA asset, a paranoid theory given credence by his brief studies at Columbia University. They warned that an Afghan collapse could lead to a hostile, American-aligned Islamic regime on the Soviet border. The map in the Situation Room told a terrifying story. From Afghanistan, the stability of the Soviet Central Asian republics Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, with their large Muslim populations, could be threatened by radical, jihadist propaganda. More strategically, the loss of Afghanistan could provide the United States with forward operating bases for signals intelligence stations, listening in on Soviet missile tests from Kapustin Yar and Tehran. It could even, in their darkest projections, become a deployment site for American Pershing or future cruise missiles, cutting the warning time for a nuclear strike from over the pole to a matter of minutes from the south. The Minutemen had locked the front door. They could not allow America to pick the lock on the back. The decision to invade, codenamed Operation Storm 333, was thus framed as a defensive maneuver to secure the perimeter. They would remove the erratic Amin, install the more pliable Babrak Karmal, and with a short demonstration of force, stabilize the country. They would reinforce the Brezhnev doctrine, prove their resolve to a watching Washington, and plug the hole in their strategic defenses. It was a catastrophic misreading of history, culture, and military reality, but it was a direct, logical offspring of the siege mentality forged by 1,000 silent sentinels in the American heartland. While Soviet commanders trembled at the specter of the Minuteman, the men who wielded it viewed their duty with a chilling, detached professionalism. To enter the world of the United States Strategic Air Command, SAS, in the 1970s is to step into a realm of pristine order, relentless drill, and theological certainty. The culture of SAC was born under the iron fist of General Curtis LeMay, who demanded perfection, readiness, and an almost religious devotion to the mission. By the 1970s, that culture had been institutionalized. For the missileers sitting their 24-hour alerts in the launch control centers beneath the planes, the Minuteman was not a weapon of terror. It was a technical system of profound responsibility. Theirs was a world of checklists, code sequences, and system status reports. They were engineers of apocalypse, maintaining the machinery of deterrence. Their daily reality was one of surreal normalcy juxtaposed with ultimate power. They would monitor the birds, perform communications checks with the launch facilities, and train endlessly for the moment that was never supposed to come. They lived with the knowledge that their tiny capsule, connected to 50 Minutemen, held more destructive power than all the munitions expended in World War II. Yet their focus was on the minutiae. A fluctuating voltage reading, a faulty printer, the quality of the coffee in the galley. This psychological distance was a feature, not a bug. The system was designed to depersonalize the act of retaliation. The two-officer rule prevented a single rogue individual from launching. The sealed authenticator codes, which changed daily and were held at the highest levels of government, ensured the order was valid. The missileers were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were the final, flawless link in a chain of command. Their purpose was not to want to turn the keys, but be absolutely prepared to do so if the lawful order came. From the vantage point of SAC headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base, and from the offices of the Pentagon, the Minuteman Force was the ultimate guarantor of peace. It made nuclear war unthinkable by making its consequences certain and survivable for America. This perspective was fundamentally alien to the Soviet experience. The U.S. felt secure behind its ocean moats and its technological shield. The USSR felt perpetually vulnerable, its history a chronicle of invasions across its land borders. This disconnect in strategic perception was fatal. When the Soviets looked at the Minuteman, they saw an existential threat that demanded constant, compensatory action. When SAC looked at the Minuteman, they saw a perfect, stable deterrent that should have discouraged adventurism. The American assessment was that the Soviet Union, rationally understanding the balance of terror, would never risk a major conventional invasion that could escalate. They were wrong. The Soviet move into Afghanistan was not an act of rational aggression in the face of overwhelming nuclear deterrence. It was a symptom of the irrational, paranoid state that very deterrence had induced. SAC's perfect weapon had made the world safe for a new kind of conflict, one fought not with ICBMs, but with Kalashnikovs in the Hindu Kush. The Soviet Union's attempt to break out of its strategic paralysis, to find a lever against the Minuteman threat, did not begin in Afghanistan. It began in Western Europe, with a weapons system they believed would shift the local balance of power without triggering a global nuclear response. The RSD-10 Pioneer, known to NATO as the SS-20 Sabre. Deployed starting in 1976, the S-20 was a masterstroke of Soviet engineering designed to exploit what they saw as a gap in the NATO alliance. It was a mobile, solid-fueled, intermediate-range ballistic missile carrying 3 Myr-Vade warheads. With a range of 5,000 kilometers, it could strike every capital in Western Europe from launch sites safely within the Soviet interior. It was accurate, survivable due to its mobility, and it explicitly targeted the European theater, theoretically decoupling the European defense from the American strategic umbrella. In the Kremlin's calculus, this move was a logical, asymmetric response to American superiority. They could not match the Minuteman in quantity or quality, but they could overwhelm NATO's theater nuclear forces. The aging American Pershing I missiles and nuclear-capable artillery, and in doing so, sowed out in Western Europe. Would the United States risk New York to save Hamburg? The SS-20 was a weapon of political coercion designed to fracture the Atlantic Alliance. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. NATO's response was not fear and division, but unified escalatory resolve. In December 1979, the very month Soviet planners were finalizing the invasion of Afghanistan, NATO foreign and defense ministers convened in Brussels and issued the double-track decision. It was a diplomatic and strategic masterstroke that mirrored, and then amplified, Soviet anxieties. Track 1. NATO committed to pursuing arms control negotiations with the USSR to limit intermediate-range nuclear forces, INF. Track 2. NATO simultaneously authorized the deployment, beginning in 1983, of Pershing II ballistic missiles and BGM-109G ground-launched cruise missiles, GLCMs, in Western Europe. The new American systems were not mere replacements. They were game changers designed to mirror the SS-20's threat back onto the Soviet homeland. The Pershing II was the true nightmare. With a range of 1,770 kilometers, it could strike targets in the western USSR from bases in West Germany. But its terror lay not in its payload, but in its speed and accuracy. It was a solid-fuel rocket that could be launched in minutes, and its radar area correlation terminal guidance gave it an accuracy of about 30 meters. Its flight time to key command centers around Moscow was estimated at 6 to 8 minutes. This was not a strategic weapon. It was a decapitation weapon. For a leadership already haunted by launch-on-warning scenarios with 30-minute ICBM flight times, the Pershing II represented the arrival of the executioner at the door, with an axe that could fall before they had time to react. The ground-launched cruise missile was a different kind of threat, stealthy, low-flying, and able to penetrate Soviet air defenses that were designed for high-altitude bombers and ballistic trajectories. Together, these systems meant that the Soviets' attempt to gain a localized advantage had instead triggered the very scenario they dreaded most: the deployment of fast, accurate, first-strike-capable American nuclear weapons on their doorstep. The double-track decision shattered the remnants of detente. For the Soviet leadership, it was irrefutable proof of hostile, aggressive intent. It confirmed their deepest paranoia. The West was not interested in stability, but in achieving overwhelming superiority. The Minuteman threatened them from across the world. The Pershing II would threaten them from their own backyard. In this atmosphere of escalating panic, the crisis in Afghanistan stopped being a peripheral concern and became an urgent front in the same, all-encompassing struggle. 1979 was the year the world seemed to unravel from Moscow's perspective, each event a domino falling toward their borders. In February, the Iranian Revolution triumphed. The Shah, a key American ally and regional policeman, fled. The new Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini was violently anti-American, but it was also fiercely anti-communist and a potent exporter of revolutionary Shia ideology. The loss of the U.S. listening posts in Iran was a tactical blow to American monitoring of Soviet missile tests, but to the KGB, the chaos was infectious. It inspired Islamist fervor that could spill into the Soviet Muslim republics. In November, the Grand Mosque seizure in Mecca by Sunni extremists sent another shockwave, forcing the Saudi monarchy to embrace a more rigid, conservative interpretation of Islam to legitimize its rule. This, in turn, increased Saudi willingness to fund and export Wahhabi ideology, including to the anti-communist fighters in Afghanistan. For the Politburo, the world was contracting, growing more hostile. American National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski's public musings about an arc of crisis were not seen as academic observation in Moscow. They were read as a statement of intent, a blueprint for Western strategy. The arc stretched from the Horn of Africa, where the Soviets had client states, through the Persian Gulf, now in turmoil, to Pakistan and Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the buckling point in the arc. By late 1979, the PDPA regime controlled little beyond Kabul. Hafizullah Amin's requests for Soviet combat troops were becoming desperate. KGB reports now claimed Amin was secretly negotiating with the Americans, potentially ready to switch sides. Whether this was true or a fabricated pretext is irrelevant. In the heated atmosphere of the Kremlin, it was believed. The decision crystallized in a series of tense meetings in December. Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov, and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, the powerful Troika, pressed the case. The ailing Brezhnev assented. Their reasoning, as recorded in the minutes, was fundamentally defensive. Under no circumstances may we lose Afghanistan. They spoke of defending the gains of socialism, but the subtext was the defense of the Soviet Union itself, from American missiles, from Islamic revolution, from strategic encirclement. The order was given. The 40th Army would cross the Amu Darya. By creating an immovable object in the central strategic balance, had finally provoked the Soviet Union into becoming an irresistible and tragically misguided force on its vulnerable periphery. The march to the climactic battle for Kabul had begun. December 24, 1979. 3 p.m. Moscow time. At the Soviet airbase at Fergana in Uzbekistan, the order is transmitted. The air begins to thrum with the deep, reverberating bass of heavy turbofan engines. The first of an armada of Antonov An-22 and Ilyushin Il-76 aircraft, their hulls painted in the drab olive of the Soviet airborne forces, begins its roll down the runway. Their destination, Kabul International Airport. This is not an invasion in the traditional sense of massed tank divisions crashing across a border. It is an air bridge, a surgical insertion designed to seize the capital's vital nodes before the Afghan government or the world fully comprehends what is happening. The operation is code-named Storm 333, and its immediate objective is not to conquer the country, but to decapitate its leadership. Aboard the first waves of transports are the elite troops of the KGB's Covert Action Unit, Alpha Group, and the GRU's Zenith Detachment, alongside paratroopers of the 103rd Guards Airborne Division. They are dressed in Afghan army uniforms, a thin disguise. Their intelligence is precise, their target singular: the Tajbeg Palace, the fortified residence of Hafizullah Amin, who is ill and unaware that his Soviet allies have sentenced him to death. Simultaneously, along the 1,200-mile Soviet-Afghan border, the mechanized might of the 40th Army begins to stir. Columns of T-62 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and BTR armored personnel carriers, their diesel engines coughing black smoke into the cold Central Asian air, assemble at crossing points on the Amu Darya River. At the strategic Hairatan Bridge, the 1st BMD of a reconnaissance battalion rolls across at 6 p.m. on December 25th. The invasion, in its full, grinding reality, has begun. In Kabul, the operation unfolds with brutal, clockwork precision. By December 27th, Soviet special forces have secured key communication centers, the radio station, and the Ministry of Defense. That evening, the assault on Tajbeg Palace commences. For 43 minutes, Alpha and Zenith fighters, supported by paratroopers and ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft vehicles used in a ground suppression role, battle Amin's loyalist guard. The palace is lit by the streaking green tracer fire of Kalashnikovs and the explosive flash of RPG rounds. Inside, Amin is killed in the crossfire. By midnight, Soviet forces announce to a confused and frightened Kabul that a revolutionary court has executed the tyrant Amin, and that Babrak Karmal, flown in from exile in Czechoslovakia, is the new leader. To the Soviet command, monitoring the operation from Tashkent and Moscow, Storm 3333 is a tactical masterpiece. Their objectives are achieved with minimal Soviet casualties. They have stabilized a client regime, removed an unreliable agent, and secured the capital. They believe they have executed a successful, limited intervention. The Politburo's calculus appears vindicated, a swift, decisive action to secure the flank. But in the darkness beyond the airport perimeter lights and the glare of the palace firefight, the true turning point is already taking shape. It is not a military event, but a political and ideological one. Across Afghanistan, in the villages and mountain valleys, the news crackles over transistor radios and spreads by word of mouth. The Russians have come. The secular, communist infidels are now physically occupying the land. For the disparate, feuding Mujahideen factions, the Soviet invasion is a unifying lightning strike. The war is no longer against an unpopular Afghan government. It is a jihad against a foreign, atheist invader. Recruitment surges. The cause is now sacred, clear and defensible to the world. In Washington, President Jimmy Carter receives the confirmation with grave dismay, but also with a sudden, clarifying focus. The strategic ambiguity is over. On December 28th, he tells his advisors, "This is the greatest threat to world peace since World War II." His response will be swift and transformative. But the most immediate and devastating consequence of the invasion unfolds in the international arena. The carefully cultivated, tattered remains of detente are torn to shreds. On January 4, 1980, Carter announces a sweeping package of punitive measures: a U.S. grain embargo, a boycott of the upcoming Moscow Olympics, and severe restrictions on technology transfers. More importantly, he signs presidential finding authorizing a massive, covert increase in support for the Afghan Mujahideen. The CIA, in partnership with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence ISI, is now directed to arm, fund, and train the resistance. The tap is turned on. Money, weapons, and advisors begin to flow. In the United Nations, the global condemnation is overwhelming. On January 14, 1980, the UN General Assembly passes Resolution ES-62, demanding the immediate, unconditional, and total withdrawal of the foreign troops from Afghanistan. The vote is 104 to 18, with even many non-aligned nations voting against the USSR. The Soviet Union finds itself internationally isolated, branded as an aggressor in a way it had not been since 1968 in Czechoslovakia. For the Soviet soldiers on the ground, the turning point is more visceral. The initial plan called for securing cities and major roads, expecting the population to accept the new Carmel government. They are greeted not with relief, but with sullen hostility and soon open gunfire. The first ambushes on Soviet convoys begin within days. The war of quick stabilization vanishes. It is replaced by the creeping realization that they are now occupants in a hostile, mountainous country, facing a guerrilla war for which their massive, tank-heavy army is woefully unprepared. The climax of the story is not the successful seizure of a palace. It is the moment the Soviet leadership, staring at their maps of Minuteman fields and Pershing II deployment schedules, believed they were executing a controlled, tactical move to relieve pressure. Instead, they had slammed their hand into a hornet's nest, triggering a global reaction that would magnify every one of their strategic fears and set in motion the process that would drain their economy, demoralize their military, and ultimately contribute to their empire's collapse. The point of no return was crossed not when the first tank rolled over the bridge, but when the world reacted and the mountains began to fight back. The die is cast. The Soviet Union is now committed to a long, grinding war of attrition. The aftermath of this decision, the brutal reality of the conflict, the escalation of Western involvement, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of the Soviet system awaits. The Soviet 40th Army entered Afghanistan with the doctrine of a conventional European war. They left 9 years later, having been forged in the crucible of a vicious counterinsurgency for which they were neither equipped nor mentally prepared. The aftermath of Storm 333 was not victory and stabilization, but a brutal education in asymmetric warfare. The initial Soviet strategy was one of occupation and pacification. They secured the major axes, the highway ring connecting Kabul, Kandahar, and Herat, and key urban centers, but control evaporated a few kilometers outside city limits. The vast, trackless mountains, the Kishleks villages, clinging to valley walls, belonged to the Mujahideen. Soviet tactics quickly adapted to a harsh new reality. Large-scale sweeps, like the 1982 Panjshir offensive against Ahmad Shah Massoud, would see regiments of motorized riflemen and paratroopers, supported by massive artillery barrages and aerial bombardment, clear a valley. They would inflict heavy casualties, destroy infrastructure, and then withdraw. Within weeks, the guerrillas would filter back. It was a war of the sieve. The Soviets could hold territory, or they could attack the enemy, but they could not do both simultaneously. The backbone of Soviet offensive power became its aviation, particularly the Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter. The Hind, with its tank-like armor, rockets, 12.7mm Gatling gun, and anti-tank missiles, was a terrifying specter. It could dominate the battlefield, providing close air support and acting as a flying infantry fighting vehicle. In the early years, Mujahideen had little defense against it beyond concentrated heavy machine gun fire. The helicopter gave the Soviets mobility and firepower across the treacherous terrain. But the Mujahideen were not a static foe. The massive, covert pipeline of Western aid, orchestrated by the CIA and Saudi Arabia and funneled through Pakistan's ISI, was transforming the resistance. What began with old British Lee-Enfield rifles and Egyptian copies of the AK-47 evolved rapidly. By the mid-1980s, Mujahideen groups were receiving modern weapons systems, Belgian FN Faal rifles, Swiss Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns, and most consequentially, British blowpipe and later American FIM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS. The decision to supply the Stinger, finalized in 1986 after intense debate in Washington, was a game-changer. The Stinger was a fire-and-forget missile with an infrared seeker that could target a helicopter's or jet's engine exhaust from miles away. Its introduction had an effect far beyond its actual kill rate, which was significant. It fundamentally altered Soviet air operations. Pilots who had once roamed with relative impunity now flew in constant fear. Attack runs became higher and less accurate. Transport helicopters adopted frantic, jinking flight paths. The psychological impact was profound. The secure vertical envelopment and close air support that had underpinned Soviet tactics were suddenly dangerously vulnerable. On the ground, the war descended into a cycle of brutality. Soviet and Afghan government forces, unable to distinguish guerrilla from civilian, increasingly relied on scorched earth tactics. They mined vast areas of farmland and pasture with millions of PFM-1 butterfly mines. They bombed and shelled villages suspected of harboring Mujahideen. They conducted ruthless cordon and search operations. The human cost was catastrophic. An estimated 1 million Afghans died. 5 million more, a third of the pre-war population, fled as refugees to Pakistan and Iran. For the Soviet soldier, the Afghanites, the war was a surreal and demoralizing experience. Drafted conscripts from cities like Moscow or Leningrad found themselves in a medieval landscape, fighting an invisible enemy for reasons they did not understand. They faced constant ambushes, road mines, and sniper fire. They grew paranoid of the local population. Morale plummeted, fueled by rampant drug use. Hashish and opium were cheap and plentiful. Hazing, China, and a growing sense of pointlessness. Letters home spoke of the horror. Bootleg cassettes of bleak Afghan rock music circulated through the ranks. The war was creating a generation of disillusioned, traumatized veterans who would return home as a potential source of social unrest, bearing the invisible wounds of a lost cause. The economic toll on the USSR was immense. Sustaining a 100,000-strong expeditionary force thousands of miles from home, flying constant air missions, and replacing destroyed equipment was a massive drain. Estimates put the cost at several $billion per year, a crippling expense for an already stagnant, inefficient economy struggling under the weight of the arms race with a resurgent, technologically superior America under President Ronald Reagan. The Minuteman's shadow had lengthened. The Soviet attempt to secure its flank against the abstract threat of American encirclement had instead locked it into a concrete, draining, and unwinnable war. The very conflict they started to project strength was now broadcasting their weakness to the world and inviting their superpower rival to pour weapons into the fight. The bleeding had begun, and the wound would not close. By 1985, the war in Afghanistan was a festering stalemate, but the political landscape that had launched it was undergoing a seismic shift. In Moscow, a new generation of leadership took power. Mikhail Gorbachev ascended to the position of General Secretary in March 1985. A pragmatist who understood the Soviet Union's deep economic and structural crises, he viewed the Afghan conflict not as a necessary offense, but as a bleeding wound that was poisoning East-West relations, draining vital resources, and crippling his domestic reform agenda perestroika and glasnost. Gorbachev's initial hope was for a political solution that would allow a dignified exit. He pressured the Afghan communist leader, Najibullah, who replaced Karmal in 1986, to pursue national reconciliation, offering cabinet posts to moderate mujahideen. The offers were rejected outright. The mujahideen, now flush with stingers and other advanced weaponry and sensing Soviet weakness, were fighting for total victory. The military situation had become intolerable. The Stinger threat had curtailed air mobility. Soviet casualty figures, though officially suppressed, were mounting over 14,000 dead by the war's end, with tens of thousands more wounded or crippled by disease. The public, once shielded from the war's reality, was beginning to learn the truth through the voices of returning veterans and the whispers of glasnost. The conflict now had a name: the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The comparison was apt and damning. Internationally, the cost was also unsustainable. The invasion had galvanized the West, leading directly to a massive U.S. military buildup and a more confrontational stance from Ronald Reagan, who famously labeled the USSR an evil empire. The Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, announced in 1983, whether feasible or not, threatened to negate the Soviet strategic force entirely, adding another layer of existential anxiety. The war made it impossible to secure meaningful arms control agreements, which Gorbachev desperately needed to reduce military spending. The decision to withdraw was made in principle by late 1986. The Geneva Accords, negotiated through the UN, provided the framework. Signed on April 14, 1988, by Pakistan, Afghanistan, the USSR, and the USA, they set a timetable. Soviet forces would begin withdrawing on May 15, 1988, and complete their exit within 9 months. The retreat itself, Operation Magistral, was a military operation in reverse. It was a running battle. Soviet columns, withdrawing along the Salang Highway, were attacked relentlessly by mujahideen seeking a final symbolic victory. The last commander of the 40th Army, General Boris Gromov, made a point of walking across the Friendship Bridge at Termez on February 15, 1989, as the final Soviet troops left Afghan soil. He famously declared, "There is not a single Soviet soldier or officer left behind me." It was a statement meant for propaganda, but it could not conceal the reality of a shattered, demoralized force leaving behind a client state doomed to collapse. The consequences of the Afghan war did not end at the bridge. They reverberated back into the heart of the Soviet Union with devastating force. The veteran crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Afghans returned to a society that did not know how to process their trauma or their experience. They were not hailed as heroes, but often viewed with suspicion or pity. Many struggled with addiction, PTSD, and alienation. They formed veterans' associations that became pockets of political dissent, criticizing the very state that had sent them to fight. Their disillusionment was a powerful solvent eating away at the legitimacy of the Soviet system. The Islamic nationalist awakening. The war had the opposite of its intended effect on the Soviet Muslim republics. Instead of sealing them off from radical influence, it exposed them to it. Central Asian conscripts had fought in Afghanistan, and news of the jihad called back along kinship lines. More importantly, the Mujahideen victory, a ragtag army of believers defeating a superpower, became a potent inspirational myth. It planted early seeds of separatist and Islamist thought in Chechnya, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, crises that would erupt after the USSR's fall. 3. The financial and moral bankruptcy. The economic drain of the war, compounded by Reagan's arms race and collapsing oil prices, pushed the Soviet economy to the brink. The war had consumed resources that could have modernized industry or fed the populace. It laid bare the grotesque inefficiency of the Soviet military-industrial complex. The moral bankruptcy was equally profound. The Great Patriotic War, narrative of a righteous defense of the motherland, could not be applied to Afghanistan. The public lost faith in the infallibility of the party and the military. The collapse of the Brezhnev doctrine. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a public, humiliating admission that the USSR could not sustain its empire by force. It sent a clear signal to the satellite states of Eastern Europe. If Afghanistan could be abandoned, why not East Germany or Poland or Czechoslovakia? The psychological barrier was broken. Within months of the last Soviet troops leaving Kabul, the revolutions of 1989 would sweep across Eastern Europe, tearing down the Berlin Wall. The Afghan War had shown the empire's core to be weak, and the periphery took notice. Finally, the war created the very monster the Soviets had feared. The networks of jihadists, funded and armed by the CIA and Saudi Arabia, with battlefield experience against a superpower, did not simply disband. They formed a diaspora of hardened, ideologically driven fighters. One of them was a wealthy Saudi engineer named Osama bin Laden. The al-Qaeda organization that grew from the Afghan crucible would, a decade later, turn its attention to the far enemy, the United States. The Minutemen had driven the Soviets into Afghanistan. The chaos they left behind would, in a final twist of tragic irony, ultimately bring terror to the American homeland on September 11, 2001. The withdrawal was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a fatal unraveling. The wound kept bleeding, not in the Hindu Kush, but in the very structure of the Soviet state. We have traced the arc from nuclear fear to military quagmire to imperial collapse. The final task is to reflect on what this chain of events meant for history, for strategy, and for the paradoxical nature of deterrence itself. The story of the Minuteman missile and the Soviet-Afghan War is not one of direct cause and effect. It is a story of ghostly influence, of how a weapon that never left its silo reshaped the world by reshaping the mind of its adversary. The 1,000 Minutemen, embedded in the bedrock of the Great Plains, achieved their stated purpose. They deterred a direct nuclear conflict between the superpowers. They made the central front of the Cold War static, frozen in a terrifying equilibrium. But in doing so, they displaced the pressure. Tectonic plates locked together, the immense force of geopolitical rivalry had to find release elsewhere. That release occurred along the perceived fault lines of the Soviet Empire in the mountains of a poor, landlocked nation that most Americans and Russians could scarcely locate on a map. This is the profound paradox at the heart of the story. The Minuteman, a weapon of ultimate destruction, fostered a sense of vulnerability so profound that it provoked a war of occupation. The Soviet leadership, staring at the unmovable object of America's secure second strike capability, felt compelled to become an irresistible force somewhere. Anywhere, they believed they could still exert control. Their terror was not of the missile's explosion, but of the strategic paralysis it represented. In seeking to break that paralysis, they triggered their own unraveling. The war revealed a fatal flaw in the logic of totalitarian systems: their inability to process complex, asymmetric reality. The same rigid, centralized command structure that could manage the countdown to a nuclear exchange could not comprehend the tribal loyalties of the Pashtun, the power of religious faith, or the simple, grinding arithmetic of guerrilla warfare. They applied a sledgehammer to a shadow and broke their arm in the swing. From the ashes of this conflict, two divergent legacies emerged. For the United States, the Mujahideen victory was celebrated as a masterstroke of covert action, a validation of proxy warfare that would inform foreign policy for decades. Yet, it also bred a dangerous illusion that America could wield the forces of militant Islam as a surgical tool, then put them away. The blowback would be catastrophic and global. For the Soviet Union, and later Russia, Afghanistan became a lasting trauma. Soviet Vietnam that seeded a deep suspicion of foreign interventions, a lasting respect for the perils of mountain warfare, and a hardened, cynical view of the West as an entity that would willingly fan the flames of jihad to destroy its rivals. The ghosts of the Afghanistan and the specter of a chaotic near abroad would haunt the Kremlin for generations. In the end, the Minuteman's most significant target was not a city, a silo, or a command bunker. It was the strategic confidence of the Soviet Union. By holding their nuclear force hostage, it compelled them to overextend their conventional power. By presenting an insurmountable wall in the north, it made them hyper-vigilant to every crack in the south. The ensuing war drained their economy, exposed their ideological emptiness, demoralized their society and accelerated the internal contradictions that led to their collapse. The silent sentinels in their Midwestern fields never fired. They didn't need to. Their mere existence, patient, invisible, and lethal, altered the course of history, proving that the most powerful weapons are sometimes those that reshape the world not through their use, but through the shadow they cast in the minds of those who fear them. The Afghan War was fought with Kalashnikovs, helicopter gunships, and Stinger missiles, but it was conceived in the cold, silent mathematics of the missile silo, a stark testament to the fact that the battles that change the world often begin not with a shot, but with a calculation of dread.